You guys ready to do this with me? So in this unit, what we're focusing on is really not only World War I, but we're also looking at the Russian Revolution. I like to lump these things together into kind of one overarching unit because of the fact that they overlap and both have implications for what's going to happen in between the Great War and World War II. So let's get started. If you remember from the last set of videos, we were talking about World War I. The Russian Revolution occurred during World War I and caused the Russians to fall out of the war. And these problems that really start the Russian Revolution, they didn't start happening during the war. They started happening really in the end of the 1800s with some of the things we've already talked about. We've already looked at the Crimean War. We've already looked at the Russo-Japanese War. We're going to see how these things, as well as some of the other issues with autocracy, for example, really play into the political situation and what's going on with Russia here. So, first of all, to define autocracy, it is the same as absolute rule. We knew already that absolutism was something that had started to occur, but the czars in Russia had really continued to hold on to these absolutist ways even into the 1900s. So whereas many other states had kind of, maybe even against their will, started to loosen up some of the policies that kept the poor in place, we're really going to see where the Russians held on very strong. They continued serfdom under feudalism. They continued to have a self-serving nobility, and there was a huge need for industrial growth, even despite the fact that the Russians had come a long way. They had not come far enough. The czars used censorship to suppress new ideas. They used a secret police to keep people in check, and they oppressed minorities using these pogroms, or these policies that are designed to be oppressive towards people and keep them kind of on the margins. And they also sent political opponents to Siberia, which is like the Arctic region over on the central and eastern side of the country. So, and I'm actually going to zoom this out a little bit more. Russia begins to industrialize. We already talked about this, and during the Industrial Revolution, they were kind of slow to get on the bandwagon, and we saw that even at the time of the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War and even the Great War, they had still not had in place the infrastructure necessary to be able to compete with other European countries. So, despite this, they did become a big steel producer. They did begin railroad projects, and foreign investments were what kind of led to this. Foreign investment does lead to better levels of development even today. But despite this, Russia lagged behind Europe going into the 1900s, and it was shown in more ways than one. The Tsar also denied workers' rights. So, whereas we talked about during the Industrial Revolution that other countries began to, they had employees that would strike, they had labor unions and things like this that would fight on behalf of the workers. None of that existed in Russia. And so it was starting to be a problem, and there was a lot of unrest as people began to cry out against the autocracy. People had no ability, however, to protest the harsh conditions because they were shut down. So child labor persisted, long work days persisted, unsafe conditions and low wages were something that they would have to continue to deal with until they were able to do something about it. So people were not happy. This led to revolutionary movements, and we're going to see these two different socialist groups, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, that kind of come into power. Now, here's the thing, that while they're both essentially socialist, the Bolsheviks are more radical than the Mensheviks. So many of these revolutionaries were forced into exile during the Romanov reign, during the time of Tsar Alexander. But and this also included Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolsheviks. They were exiled because of their liberal views. Now, there were other big problems. The Russo-Japanese War, which was a war that was fought between Russia and Japan, of all countries, over Korea and Manchuria. Russia got their rear ends handed to them, which really highlighted Russian weakness. This didn't look good for anyone. Europe's like, what the heck just happened? And everyone in Europe is super humiliated by this. And so Russia got defeated. This led kind of to all these things combined in 1905 led to revolution, and there was Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday occurred when Russian guards opened fire on unarmed protesters. Now, I know you're not supposed to protest in the Tsarist regime in Russia, but they did, and the guards opened fire. This resulted in the Duma. So eventually, they're going to pressure the Tsar to open up a legislative assembly, and but here's the thing, is that the Tsar really didn't let the Duma do anything. So even though the Bloody Sunday, the 1905 revolution here, seemed like it was going to bring about some kind of greater good for Russia, it really didn't do anything yet. World War I, meanwhile, started to occur within the next decade, and there were major Russian losses here. And then another big problem here. So these are all the big problems. Another big problem here is this guy Rasputin. All right. So first of all, if you've seen Anastasia, you already know all this, right? Maybe not quite. Anastasia is a great movie, but nevertheless, Rasputin, this guy, all right, the bad guy in Anastasia, he was kind of a crazy guy that was hired by Tsarina, the Tsar's queen, essentially, Alexandria. All right, Rasputin he gains favor from the Tsar's family because he apparently has some kind of a capacity to heal their son or whatnot. He's like some kind of a medicine man, but he's also this weird mystic fellow that kind of starts to, in essence, control the outcomes of Russian politics by controlling the Tsarists. And so all these issues ultimately lead to what we're going to call the March Revolution in 1917. It started with female textile workers. Within days, about 200,000 workers had joined up and rioted over the shortages of supplies, and they had their slogan, "Down with the autocracy." This now was also very effective because soldiers actually sided with the protesters, which in turn causes Tsar Nicholas to step down. Now, again, this is all during the war. All these issues are going on. The Tsar and his family were all killed by revolutionaries, and this is going to be the end, or this is going to bring about the end of 3-century-old Romanov dynasty. All right, so now we're going to have this new provisional or temporary government take over in Russia. But here's the problem. The provisional government screws up. It created the moderate Duma. So the moderate in this context means it wasn't super far right conservative, it wasn't super far left liberal, but it was headed by this guy named Alexander Kerensky. Now, the fact that it was moderate was probably a pretty good thing, but the fact that it kept Russia in the war really kind of sealed its fate before it even got going good. Because it was a big mistake that led soldiers it led Russia to lose support of people and soldiers. And so these local level Soviets had begun to form throughout the country, and they were made up of workers, they were made up of peasants, they were made up of soldiers, just kind of like a huge hodgepodge of all these different individuals, and they had huge local influence. So after the Tsarist regime is torn down due to the revolution, Lenin is going to return from exile. He had been leading the Bolsheviks from afar during this time period, but he began unifying Soviets under his leadership, starting with Petrograd. So all these local level councils began to become unified under Lenin's guidance. And this is going to lead to, well, he was saying, all power to the Soviets. And by November 1917, the workers storm the Winter Palace, which is where the Legislative Assembly was, and they overthrow the Provisional Government. So you can kind of see a summary of the cause and effects of the two Russian revolutions if you look at this chart here that is actually in your book. So I would recommend you look at that a little more closely. But moving on, now that Lenin is in power, he addresses many of the Russian problems. And so as a communist, or as a socialist communist, he believes in the idea of not a class system where you've got a rich group of elites that control the entire political and economic situation in Russia. Now, this has been how things were done under the Tsarist regime, but one of the first things that Lenin is going to do is redistribute land to peasants. He also is going to bring factories under the control of workers. These are things that peasants and workers might think are pretty cool, but the people that were in charge are not very, maybe those individuals wouldn't have been very happy with this. But he also was going to get people out of World War One. The problem with this, though, is that the way he does it is through the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, what Lenin's trying to do is he's just trying to get out of the war so that he can deal with the issues of fixing Russia. But because the terms were so humiliating, it brought out a lot of the bad feelings among the oppositions of the Bolsheviks. And so it made a lot of Russians mad, in other words. And it triggered the Russian Civil War between the Russian Red Army, which were the Bolsheviks, and the White Army, which were basically everybody else. Now, when I say everybody else, I literally mean it. There were socialists that weren't quite far left Bolsheviks. There were people who wanted democracy. There were people who wanted authoritarian. They wanted absolute monarchy. There were people who wanted constitutional monarchy. Basically, everyone else, except for Bolsheviks, were lumped together in the White Army. So the Red Army, here's a chart. I kind of drew out this chart to show a breakdown between the two groups. The Red Army was unified. It was just the Bolsheviks. They had expert leadership under Leon Trotsky. They were very decisive in their goals, and they were victorious a lot. The White Army was not politically together because of how many different kinds of people were apart, and because of that, they could not agree on what they wanted and what the goals of their movement was. They also received help from the West, so including the United States, and they lost the war. And the Bolsheviks came to power. The result of this Russian Civil War was about 14 million Russians died. Russia was in complete turmoil at the time that the Bolsheviks really established power over their state, and it left Lenin and the Bolsheviks in charge, and they brought the whole of Russia under strong and strict state control. The goal ultimately was to restore order from chaos. And so in order to do this, Vladimir Lenin wanted to fix the economy. He used a new economic policy in order to do this, and this policy included pretty much small-scale capitalism, but it was just small-scale capitalism. And I make a point to say that, I mean, the Bolsheviks, they were communists, right? That's the reason why I'm saying this as if it was not really. It's almost weird to think about it, but what was happening essentially is that peasants could sell surplus crops, okay, so they make a little bit of money to get themselves out of extreme poverty. Some factories and farms were able to be privately owned, and foreign investment was encouraged because, as I mentioned earlier, foreign investment is usually seen as a good thing for a country's development. There were also political reforms. So all these are going to be your economic reforms. There are also political reforms we have to talk about. The end of nationalism. Communists absolutely abhor and fear nationalism because the idea behind a communist society is that everyone is the same. Economically the same, in terms of class structure they're the same. Nationalism promotes one's well-being and one's ethnic identity above others, so it leads people to believe that they're better, perhaps, on the basis of who they are. And even though it can be unifying, it can also be very, very divisive. And so that divisive portion is what the communists are afraid of with nationalism. So he also establishes a new state called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. So they no longer go by Russia at this point, they go by the USSR, which is a series of self-governing republics, but they answer to the Communist Party. So you could have local level leaders, but in fact those leaders were lackeys for the overarching Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So there's certainly more that we're going to discuss involved in the USSR, but for now, we're going to leave it there because we're going to talk about the rest in the context of the interwar period, the things that go on between World War I and World War II, which lead into World War II and then the modern era. Stay tuned for more videos, and I'll see you on the internet. Thanks for watching.